Good morning, Pelham Road. Well, it's Friday, and so we made it. We got to the end of the week. I hope you're going to have a great weekend. I hope you got some big plans. You know, go do something. I need a little help in the comment section below, if you don't mind. Could you recommend a theme song? A theme song for Good Morning, Pelham Road. You know, the first thing I thought of was the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun. But you pick out what you think is an appropriate theme song for this little show, okay? All right, let's get to the devotion. The passage I'm reading today comes from Matthew chapter 5. You'll be very familiar with it. And I'm reading it actually from the King James today. That's King James. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be children of your Father which is in heaven. Jesus was an idealist, an utopian dreamer, the Son of God. Let us admit this is an odd passage of Scripture. Now, it's not hard to reconcile this with Jesus' life. I mean, to witness the way Jesus dealt with humanity, it's clear that he had enemies. He was unafraid of them, yet it appears that he held no lasting animosity towards them. So there's really little doubt that these words reflect the moral code of Jesus. But the question that is really hanging out there is not do these apply to Jesus, but how do they apply to us? What are they to us? Well, let's begin by asking, who has enemies? Okay. Let's start with who doesn't have enemies. Okay, who doesn't have enemies? Babies. Okay. The chairperson overseeing a large financial foundation. And that's the end of the list. You know, this girl Marie, I know she had lots of friends, no enemies, until she was 16. And finally, at 16, she had enough, and she turned to her friends and she told them that they needed to stop making fun of Mr. Wilkins, the biology teacher, just because he had a lisp. And as soon as she stood up to him, she had enemies. David, now he had a large circle of friends, but when he was 50, it was discovered that while he believed in God, he no longer believed in the virgin birth. Many folks at church stopped talking to him. So the quick point here is babies don't have enemies because they don't have opinions. And presidents of foundations don't have enemies because they have money to give away. So the takeaway is this: have money or don't have opinions. And you can have friends, not enemies. If you got money and you won't have opinions, you can have friends and no enemies. Otherwise, you might have enemies. When you begin to speak up, when you begin to take action, it is likely, probable even, that you're going to make some enemies. That's why Jesus is so familiar with the subject. He had plenty of enemies. Some good people, no, great people, have enemies. Jesus had enemies. Good folks like Bill Gates, LeBron James, they've got enemies. Of course, there are people who are not as great and not as good as these, who are actually troubled people, and they actually have enemies. I will refrain from offering a list of those people. So it's no wonder this is part of the Jesus curriculum. It was a universal theme. Everybody has enemies. So how do we love the enemy? And maybe more importantly, why? Well, I'm almost out of time. So the quick answer to how is by forgiveness and by recognizing that our enemies are much more than what they are to us. The why, well, that's a little more involved. Edwin Stanton and Abraham Lincoln were rivals, even enemies. Once the two were hired to defend the same client. Stanton did not think much of Lincoln's lack of polish. He once called Lincoln the original guerrilla. After the trial, Lincoln returned to Illinois despondent. By all accounts, Stanton was a much better lawyer. But he was also a man who took names and held grudges. Stanton did everything that he could do to oppose Lincoln when Lincoln ran for the office of president. But of course he failed. As you know, Lincoln went on to win the presidency. And when time came for Lincoln to choose a cabinet, he wanted to pick Stanton to be on his cabinet, to be the Secretary of War, I believe. Others argued against it, but Lincoln insisted on picking Stanton. Now, is this the story of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer? Not really. It's attributed to Lincoln, and we will assume that the following quote belongs to the 16th president. Did Stanton say I was a fool? Then I dare say I must be one, Lincoln said, for Stanton is generally right, and he always says what he means. There's your secret to loving your enemies. You see, loving your enemies is never about your enemies. The enemy will never, ever be nice to you. They're not going to treat you any better. You can count on your enemies to remain your enemies. The secret is in your attitude, my attitude. Notice Lincoln's. This quote says far more about Lincoln than it does Stanton. Did Stanton say I was a fool? Then I dare say I must be one. For Stanton is generally right, and he always says what he means. You see, Lincoln disarmed people with his humor and his understanding. See, he understood whatever Stanton wasn't Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. Having confidence in yourself goes a long way towards offering forgiveness to others. When we don't believe in ourselves, others can become our enemies. When we do believe in ourselves, they just become gnats, bothersome but harmless. Have a great weekend.